Do you think you know Greek myths? Zeus, lightning, Olympus. But what if I told you all of that is just the tip of the iceberg, built on the bones of those who came before? Today, we'll descend into the darkness of time, into the era before the gods, when titans ruled the world. These are not children's tales. This is a chronicle of cosmic tyranny, brutal coups, and family secrets so horrific they tried to erase them from history. You'll learn how the supreme god of the sky became the victim of history's most shocking betrayal, carried out by his own son with a weapon forged by his wife. How a new ruler, consumed by paranoia, found a way to dispose of his children that will make you shudder, and why the birth of the most beautiful goddess of love began with an act of unthinkable cruelty. And from this chaos, from this gaping void, things simply began to appear, not with a bang, but rather in a process of eternal unfolding. First came Gaia, Earth itself. She wasn't born into the world, she was the world. Hills, valleys, rivers, forests, all arose from her flesh. Gaia wasn't just a maternal figure, she was the supreme matriarch, fertile, vast, and, as we shall see, not one to be trifled with. She became the first foundation of life, the firmament underfoot, even before feet existed to stand upon her. Next came Tartarus, the deep abyss. Not the underworld, not quite, though later myths would repurpose it as such. Tartarus was more like the basement of reality. Far beneath Gaia's surface, darker than night, it would one day serve as a prison for divine rebels. But for now, it simply was, a gloomy echo beneath the nascent cosmos. Then came Eros, not a cherubic valentine with love arrows, but a far more ancient, abstract force. This Eros was the glue that held everything together. He was the driving force of creation, the principle of attraction that made Gaia fertile, that gave form to the formless. Without him, chaos would have remained chaotic. With him, the universe took its first breath. From chaos also emerged Nyx, night, cloaked in darkness and mystery, older than any god yet to come. A figure of profound reverence and even dread. It was said that even the mighty Zeus would think twice before crossing her. With her came Erebus, the darkness of the netherworld, not sinister, merely unlit. Nyx and Erebus together birthed a whole host of shadowy offspring: Hypnos, sleep; Thanatos, death; Moros, doom; Nemesis, retribution; and others with names worthy of Gothic novels. These primordial beings were not deities in our understanding. They were not the kind to appear as a shepherd to seduce a mortal. They were concepts, forces, personified, yes, but barely anthropomorphic. They were nature before nature became poetic. Gaia, however, had other plans. She decided it was time for company. And so, without a partner, much like a gardener single-handedly breaking ground for a garden, she birthed Uranus, the sky. He wasn't a bearded old man reclining on a cloud. Uranus was the entire celestial dome, stretching over Gaia in an eternal embrace. The ancients believed the sky was a physical object, a solid vault. One can imagine Uranus as some kind of divine lid, pressed tightly against the earth. Together, Gaia and Uranus began to populate the universe, not with trees and birds, but with beings, their children, the first true generation of gods, the Titans. In the classical canon, there were 12: Oceanus, who girdled the earth with his watery embrace; Hyperion, the light-bringer, and father of the sun, moon, and dawn; Coeus and Creus, whose names are now known mostly to crossword enthusiasts; the wise Themis, goddess of natural law and order; Mnemosyne, the embodiment of memory; Phoebe, radiant intellect; and Rhea, the future mother of the gods. And then there was Cronus, the youngest, the most cunning, and perhaps the most dangerous of them all. But Gaia's fertility wasn't limited to the Titans. She and Uranus also birthed the Cyclopes, enormous one-eyed blacksmiths, skilled in forging storms, and the Hecatonchires, beings so ludicrously proportioned they defy cinematic adaptation. Each had 50 heads and 100 arms. Imagine the difficulty in finding them gloves. Uranus, surprisingly fastidious for a cosmic being, was repulsed by his less conventional offspring. He deemed them monstrous and, in an act that can only be described as divine suppression, shoved them back inside Gaia, not metaphorically, but physically, into her very womb. One assumes it wasn't too comfortable. Gaia, for all her patience, was not a passive entity. She groaned under the burden, quite literally, and finally decided enough was enough. She forged a colossal sickle from flint, one of the few available materials in a universe still under construction. Then, in hushed whispers, she summoned her Titan sons to rise against their father. Only one responded to her call. Cronus, clever Cronus, ambitious Cronus, the youngest of the Titans and the most willing to get his hands, or rather, his sickle, dirty. Under the cloak of night, Cronus lay in wait. As Uranus descended to embrace Gaia, Cronus struck. With a swift, merciless motion, he severed the sky's manhood. Yes, that's not a metaphor. The Greeks were vivid in their storytelling. There was no room for subtle symbolism here. From Uranus's blood, spilled upon Gaia, sprang the Erinyes, the Furies of vengeance. There also emerged the giants, those colossal adversaries of the later gods, and the Meliades, nymphs of the ash trees, a strangely delicate addition to the bloody harvest. Uranus's severed member fell into the sea. From the frothing foam, Aphrodite emerged, the beautiful, radiant goddess, who paradoxically owed her existence to an act of dismemberment. Greek mythology, it seems, sees no contradiction between beauty and brutality. With Uranus overthrown, Cronus took the throne of the cosmos. The Titans now ruled, and Cronus took his sister Rhea as his wife. Again, divine family trees often intertwine, like ivy on temple ruins. Together, they presided over an age that later generations would call the Golden Age, a time of no suffering, no war, no want. A time without humans, mind you, but a rather pleasant era for gods. But peace in myth is a fragile thing. Cronus, like his father before him, became fearful. Uranus, in his final agonizing utterance, warned him that one day Cronus's own child would rise up to overthrow him, just as he himself had done to his father. The seed of paranoia was sown, and it bore bitter fruit. Cronus devised a preemptive strategy devoid of both compassion and nutritional value. Every time Rhea bore him a child, he swallowed it whole. One by one, their offspring, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, were consumed, not killed, but merely stashed away inside their father. Cronus became less a ruler and more a walking nursery. But we'll return to that story in the next chapter. Before we leave the dawn of the cosmos behind, it's worth considering the deeper meaning of these stories. Myth is not mere entertainment. It is philosophy in sandals. The overthrow of Uranus is more than divine patricide. It is the triumph of change over stagnation. Gaia's rebellion speaks to the resilience of the earth, the refusal of the feminine to be suppressed. Cronus, the god of time, becomes a cautionary tale. Even time itself cannot escape fate. These myths resonate across cultures. The Hittites told of Kumarbi, who overthrew the sky god Anu. by biting off his genitals. Yes, genitals again. The Babylonians sang of Marduk's battle with Tiamat, the monstrous mother of chaos. In each case, the old order crumbles to make way for the new. It's no accident that these tales emerge in early civilizations, grappling with questions of power, the rise and fall of kings, the cycles of rule and rebellion. In myth, we see a blueprint for monarchy, for revolution, even for generational trauma, drawn in the bold lines of legend. And so, the stage is set. The Titans now stride across the world, vast and radiant, embodiments of natural forces and cosmic order. Humanity has yet to appear. Olympus is but a dream. The gods, such as they are, operate more as living laws of nature than characters with personalities. But even now, the cycle has begun. Cronus has overthrown his father, and in turn, he will be overthrown, because in every age, in every myth, the same truth waits quietly in the wings. Time devours all. Cronus's reign, by all ancient accounts, was a rather pleasant time, unless, of course, you were one of his children. For most, it was a golden age, an era when the earth generously yielded its bounty. The seasons were mild, and mortals, if they existed at all, suffered no taxes, no backaches, no unsolicited oracles. There were no wars, no crime, and best of all, no gods squabbling amongst themselves atop the hills. It was a time when law was unnecessary, because, as the myth has it, no one behaved badly. One can imagine it was rather like eternal Sunday afternoon without a shortage of tea. But beneath the surface of this placid world, an anxiety simmered, not of the world, but of its ruler. Cronus, the Titan of time, king of all that was, faced a problem. He had become his father. To be fair, Cronus overthrew Uranus for cruelty and suppression. But, as is often the case in myths and monarchies, the rebel becomes the tyrant once the crown touches his head. Cronus heard a prophecy, not from some mountain oracle or mysterious old woman with a teapot, but from his own wounded father, Uranus, who, in his post-castration wisdom and bitterness, mumbled that one day Cronus's child would rise and depose him. This, as it turns out, is the sort of thing that sticks in one's head. And so, Cronus decided to resort to what can only be described as a unique parenting technique, swallowing his children. Every time his wife and sister, because in myths, it's often the same person, Rhea bore him a child, Cronus would open his mouth wide and gulp the infant down whole. No chewing, no remorse, just one big divine gulp, like oysters, only more sentient. First came Hestia, the goddess of hearth and home, then Demeter, the future goddess of grain, then Hera, the future queen of Olympus, followed by Hades and Poseidon, the gods of the underworld and the sea, respectively. One by one, each was swallowed and stashed away in Cronus's belly. It's not entirely clear what conditions existed in his divine digestive tract, but rest assured, they were still alive. Rhea, understandably, was tired of the arrangement. One can forgive her hesitation in openly expressing her displeasure. Cronus, after all, had just overthrown a tyrannical father with a sickle. But after the fifth divine swallowing, even the most patient Titaness would start drawing a line. So, when she became pregnant for the sixth time, she sought help. Not from Cronus, obviously, nor from the local Titan HR department, but from Gaia, her own mother. The primordial Earth Mother, as always, had a plan. When the time came for the child to be born, Rhea secretly decamped to the island of Crete, a land that, in myths, always seems to be the ideal place to hide divine children. There, in a cave atop Mount Ida, she gave birth to her youngest son, Zeus. To fool Cronus, Rhea wrapped a stone, convincingly resembling an infant in swaddling clothes, and presented it to him as the newborn. Cronus, the ever-efficient cannibal, swallowed it whole, no questions asked. What this says more about his parenting skills or his taste in minerals is unclear. And so, Zeus was hidden, secretly raised in a Cretan cave. Some say he was raised by nymphs, others by a goat named Amalthea, whose milk nourished him. The story varies depending on which poet you ask, but the essence remains the same. The future king of the gods was fed on wild honey, mountain air, and, presumably, a sense of destiny. To hide his cries, a troop of warriors known as the Curetes danced and clashed their shields, drowning out the infant's wails. This is a rare instance of expressive dance being used as a military defense system. Meanwhile, in the divine gut, Cronus continued living, blissfully unaware that his undoing was literally brewing outside. Now, let's take a slight detour. While the Titans and their offspring were battling amongst themselves, it's worth noting what the Greeks believed about the world as a whole. The gods were not distant beings in the heavens. They were present, woven into the very fabric of nature and time. Trees whispered with dryads, rivers flowed with naiads. Every breeze, every storm, every spark of fire had a divine presence. Time, personified by Cronus, wasn't just ticking clocks. He was time. His reign, therefore, represented not merely power, but inevitability. He could not be reasoned with or escaped. And so, the idea that he would be overthrown by his own progeny reflected not just the cyclical nature of power, but a deeper fear that even time itself must yield. Back to Crete. Zeus grew tall, strong, and, unlike his titanic kin, possessed a flair for the dramatic. Reaching maturity, he returned to challenge his father, but not with brute force alone. First, he employed cunning. Depending on which version of the myth you prefer, and the Greeks had several, Zeus enlisted the help of Metis, the goddess of wisdom, who gave Cronus an emetic. Not quite poetic justice, but close. Cronus, having ingested this divine emetic, disgorged his children in reverse order. First came the stone, still wrapped in his baby blanket. Then Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, and finally, Hestia. Each emerged adult, and presumably quite disgruntled with the whole ordeal. Now reunited, Cronus's 6 children did not go quietly into exile or therapy. No, they declared war, a great, terrible 10-year war. The Titanomachy was about to commence. But that is a story for the next chapter. For now, we must pause and reflect on what this chapter of myth tells us. The swallowing of children, as horrific as it sounds, is an ancient metaphor that appears across cultures. In Mesopotamian myths, older gods are consumed or imprisoned by younger ones. In Vedic tales, gods are born, hidden, and return cyclically. All reflect the same truth. The younger generation is both hope and threat. Every new child represents the end of their parents' reign. Power, after all, is temporary, and no one knows this better than the gods. In the myth of Cronus, we also find the seeds of the very definition of time. His name, Cronus, would later become conflated with Kronos, the personification of time. Likely they were distinct figures initially, but myth, much like rivers, tends to merge its tributaries. Cronus becomes time. And what does time do but devour all that exists? And yet, time also creates. From Cronus's belly emerged the future Olympian gods, not lifeless, but preserved, waiting. Time consumed them, but it also made their return inevitable, a rather elegant metaphor for cycles, rebirth, and revolutions, wouldn't you say? And one final note on that stony infant. According to later myths, Zeus placed the swaddled stone at Delphi, the sacred center of the world, as a landmark. It became known as the omphalos, or navel of the world, a sort of cosmic belly button, if you will. Pilgrims made journeys to see it, literally a stone wrapped in myth, representing the moment the cosmos began to shift. And so ends Cronus's short, troubled reign as supreme ruler. He who tried to cheat fate by consuming his children was undone by those he never truly met. One could almost feel sorry for him if he weren't such a profoundly unpleasant father. Now the stage is set. On one side, the Titans, ancient, immense, rooted in the primordial forces of the world. On the other, the Olympians, young, bold, and in the mood to cause a bit of chaos. The battle between them will shake the very foundations of the earth. Mountains will crumble, seas will boil, and the sky itself will tremble. But that, as always, is a story for another time. For now, we leave our young Zeus, triumphant in his first great act, standing on the precipice of war with lightning in his blood and rebellion in his heart. The old order has been challenged. A storm is coming, and Cronus, poor, hapless Cronus, is left wondering how it all went so wrong. War had never before visited the cosmos. Until now, divine disputes were more like poetic drama than actual combat. Cronus had deposed Uranus with a single brutal act, more akin to surgery than a scuffle, and the rest of the Titans had merely nodded in assent, perhaps relieved to be rid of a father who treated his children like disobedient houseplants. But when Zeus freed his siblings from Cronus's divine digestive tract, something changed. For the first time in the history of what it was, two generations of gods stood in opposition. And this was no family disagreement about who forgot to bring the proper offering for the winter solstice. This was war with a capital W, the kind sung by poets with blood in their throats and dust on their lyres. On one side stood the Titans, ancient, elemental, immense. They embodied the raw forces of the world, the boundless ocean, the blazing sun, the turning heavens. Powerful, yes, but also set in their ways. They were accustomed to being worshipped, or at least left undisturbed. On the other side were the Olympians, younger, hungrier, and armed with such a potent sense of destiny that it could curdle milk. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades led the charge, supported by their sisters, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia, and a growing band of divine allies. These were not primordial abstractions, but gods with personalities, ambitions, and that self-assurance that comes only from immortals who have never paid rent. The war is known as the Titanomachy, a word best uttered with a stiff drink. It means Battle of the Titans, though that hardly conveys the scale. This was not merely a squabble over succession. It was a seismic rupture in the fabric of creation. Mountains crumbled, rivers reversed their courses, the very heavens shuddered. The battlefield, according to tradition, was Thessaly, though given the scope of the conflict, one can assume it spilled far beyond the map. 10 years the war raged. Neither side could gain a clear advantage. The Titans fought from Mount Othrys, a grim peak befitting their age and gravitas. The Olympians, meanwhile, occupied Mount Olympus, then smaller, but destined to become the celestial penthouse. It was a stalemate, a divine cold war that had turned hot. Lightning clashed with stone, earthquakes rumbled beneath the sea, and the heavens rang with the clash of immortal weapons. But the Titans, for all their strength, had a weakness. They lacked innovation. Their might was ancient but static. The Olympians, however, adapted. They learned, they evolved, and soon they would find the allies needed to tip the scales in their favor. Gaia reappears, the primordial mother, always watching, always intervening at the right moment. Perhaps she favored her grandson, Zeus. Perhaps she simply enjoyed a bit of chaos now and then. Whatever the reason, she revealed a crucial truth. The Titans could be defeated, but only if the Olympians secured the aid of those once betrayed by Cronus. The Hecatonchires and the Cyclopes. Remember them, the 100-handed and one-eyed blacksmiths, exiled by Uranus, imprisoned by Cronus, and now languishing in the depths of Tartarus. Not the ideal allies, but desperate wars required desperate resurgences. Zeus, never one to miss an opportunity, descended into the abyss. He fought past the monstrous guardians and broke down the prison doors. The Cyclopes, in gratitude, forged weapons for their liberators. To Zeus, they gave the thunderbolt, to Poseidon, the trident, and to Hades, the helm of darkness, which rendered its wearer invisible and, if legend is to be believed, rather smug. Armed with these new implements, and with 100 hands hurling boulders and trees like javelins, the Olympians turned the tide of the war. Now, picture the battlefield, the air thick with divine energy. Lightning arcs across the sky like angry comets. Massive boulders flying through the heavens like bowling balls launched from catapults. Uprooted trees, mountains gouged out. And at the center, Zeus, no longer the hidden infant from Crete, but the god of storms incarnate, hurling thunderbolts as if it were a family sport. Cronus, to his credit, fought with grim determination. He wielded the sickle that had felled Uranus. The Titans, colossal and fearsome, rallied around him. Atlas, Hyperion, Iapetus, and the rest. But age was against them in every sense. It was no longer their world. In a final battle, said to have lasted for days without respite, Zeus unleashed his full fury. The sky cracked, flames poured from the earth, and finally, the Titans began to fall. Defeated, the male Titans were cast down into Tartarus, imprisoned behind adamantine gates, guarded by the newly freed Hecatonchires, who apparently found their calling as celestial prison wardens. Cronus, their leader, was bound and vanished into mythical obscurity. Later traditions would relocate him to the Isles of the Blessed, where he would peacefully rule over the departed, or even reimagine him as a god of harvest and peace, a sort of divine retirement plan. The female Titans, Rhea, Themis, Mnemosyne, and the others, were spared, perhaps out of respect, or because Zeus held no particular grievance against them. They were, after all, the bearers of law, memory, and fate, concepts that even the new gods dared not transgress. One Titan, however, received a special punishment, Atlas. For his part in the rebellion, Zeus condemned him to hold up the heavens, not the earth, as is often misdepicted in marble statues and gym logos, but the heavens themselves, forever. A solitary figure at the edge of the world, muscles straining under the dome of the sky. No end, no relief. The original upper body workout. With victory over the Titans, the age of the Olympians began. But power, as always, came with a burden. Zeus, now king, divided the cosmos with his brothers. To himself, he took the sky. To Poseidon, the sea, and to Hades, the underworld. Not hell, but a shadowy realm where the departed dwelled, surrounded by ghosts, dreams, and the occasional hero eager to meet their end. The earth, meanwhile, remained neutral territory, common ground, the realm of mortals, myths, and interference. And with order restored, the gods took up residence on Mount Olympus, not merely the summit, but a palace, a place of cloudy halls, golden thrones, feasts of ambrosia, and drama typical of dynastic soap operas. However, not all wounds healed. Gaia, displeased once more, perhaps by the harsh punishment of her Titan sons, birthed a new rival, Typhon. But that, as you might guess, is a story for another chapter. For now, let us pause and consider the significance of this mythical war. The Titanomachy is not merely a tale of violence. It is a symbolic clash of old and new, static and dynamic, the eternal forces of nature and the caprices of gods driven by personalities. The Titans represent order and inevitability, the rising of the sun, the flow of the ocean, the rotation of the stars. The Olympians, on the other hand, represent change, passion, rebellion, very human traits for immortal beings. In Greek thought, this war is the moment the universe stopped being abstract and became personal. The Titans were powerful, yes, but they did not meddle in mortal affairs. The Olympians would interfere, punish, reward, and fall in love with alarming regularity. They were, in short, gods made in the image of humanity, and that made them both relatable and terrifying. Historically, the Titanomachy reflects ancient cultural shifts. Some scholars see in it echoes of the transition from older, pre-Hellenic deities to the Olympian pantheon, a kind of religious rebranding. Others note similarities to Near Eastern myths, where younger gods overthrow primordial beings in messy cosmic upheavals. But the enduring appeal lies in its drama, the idea that even gods must struggle, that even the mightiest can fall, and that victory often comes not from brute force, but from strategy, unity, and a timely emetic. It's also a testament to the Greeks' genius for storytelling. They gave us gods who are flawed, noble, petty, and profound, gods who fight, laugh, cry, and seduce. And from the ruins of war, they built a cosmos not of abstract principles, but of characters. And so, as the dust settles over Mount Othrys, as Tartarus echoes with the groans of the fallen Titans, and Olympus gleams with the light of a new regime, we find ourselves on the cusp of a new world. But in taking their thrones, the gods inherit more than power. They inherit prophecy, pride, and the seeds of their own downfall. Because if history has taught us anything, and Greek myth is, if nothing else, a very dramatic history, it is that no reign is eternal, not even for the gods. The war was over. The Titans had fallen. Their great thunder had quieted, and their once vast thrones lay in ruins under the weight of time and justice, or what passed for justice when dispensed by gods with suspiciously personal vendettas. Zeus and his siblings now ruled from their glittering perch atop Mount Olympus. They looked down upon a cosmos that was, if not entirely orderly, then at least properly organized. Cronus was banished to Tartarus. The Titans' throne room on Mount Othrys lay in ruins. The Cyclopes returned to their forges, and the Hecatoncheires, bless their numerous arms, found gainful employment as prison guards, a rare success story in divine rehabilitation. But if you think peace followed triumph, you've clearly never read Greek mythology. Zeus, now king of the gods, wasn't content with merely wearing a crown and wielding lightning like the captain of a celestial javelin-throwing team. No, he faced a problem that has plagued every ruler from the Bronze Age to the boardroom: legitimacy. It's one thing to win power. It's quite another to hold on to it. And somewhere beneath the triumphant roar of Olympus, an ancient whisper continued to sound. Prophecy. Gaia and Uranus, those primordial sages, had once warned Cronus that he would be overthrown by his child. That prophecy had come to pass in the most spectacular and sickening way. But by the will of fate, irony, and perhaps genetics, Cronus's successor, Zeus, found himself the subject of a chillingly similar prediction, that he too would one day be overthrown by his own child. Now, Zeus, not being a fool, took this very seriously. He had just orchestrated an entire cosmic war to overthrow his father. The last thing he wanted was to suffer the fate of Uranus and Cronus, to be overthrown, dismembered, or digested. So, he did what many insecure tyrants before and since have done. He tried to get ahead of fate. Here, the myth takes an interesting turn. You see, Zeus had many consorts, immortals, mortals, nymphs, the occasional shape-shifting cloud. His romantic resume was extensive. But one goddess stood out, Meti. Meti was not just beautiful, she was brilliant. Her name literally means wisdom or cunning counsel. She was the daughter of Oceanus and Tethys, making her an Oceanid and one of the original deities associated with practical intelligence. Metis didn't just know things, she understood them, a dangerous quality for a spouse if you're haunted by prophecy. So when Metis became pregnant with Zeus's child, his fears were confirmed by another oracle. The child she would bear would one day surpass him. And worse, the next child, Metis's second offspring, would be a son, powerful enough to overthrow even the mighty thunder god. Zeus did not take this news calmly. Naturally, he did what any sensible Almighty would do in such a situation. He swallowed her. Yes, deceiving her with flattery and, we can assume, an impressive dinner. Zeus opened his mouth wide and consumed his pregnant lover whole. In the realm of mythology, this isn't considered the end of a relationship. If anything, it was the beginning of one of the strangest births in divine history. This act of divine consumption wasn't unprecedented. Remember, Cronus once swallowed his own children in a misguided attempt at family planning. But where Cronus digested, Zeus assimilated. Metis did not die. She lived within him, whispering, advising, perhaps plotting. And the child, well, it didn't stop growing. Eventually, Zeus began to suffer from headaches. Not ordinary migraines brought on by stress, but blinding, skull-splitting, cosmically agonizing pains, as if an idea were trying to break its way out of his skull, which, in a way, it was. In desperation for relief, Zeus called for Hephaestus, his blacksmith's son. Though in some versions, the axe is held by Prometheus or even Hermes. Whichever assistant you prefer, the solution was exquisitely simple and brutally theatrical. They split Zeus's head open with a bronze axe. From the wound sprang Athena, fully grown, clad in armor, spear in hand, and letting out a triumphant war cry that reportedly echoed across heaven and earth. It was, to say the least, a memorable entrance. Athena would become one of the most revered goddesses in the Greek pantheon, the goddess of wisdom, strategic warfare, crafts, and urban life. She was, in many ways, the perfect Olympian, born of power and wisdom, loyal to her father, and utterly uninterested in rebellion. She would never attempt to overthrow Zeus. In a neat bit of mythological judo, the prophecy was fulfilled and diffused. The child arrived, but not as a threat. Yet, the fear of usurpation remained etched in the divine psyche of Zeus. He had seen it happen twice. Perhaps that's why he ruled with such magnitude, a mix of charm and tyranny, favor and thunderous wrath. He could be the protector of oaths and the punisher of oath-breakers, a lover of justice and a champion of questionable seductions. While Zeus worried about fate and fatherhood, other Olympians were busy expanding their portfolios. Poseidon ruled the seas, but not without conflict. He vied with other gods for dominion over coastal cities. The most famous instance being Athens, where he lost a divine talent contest to his niece, Athena. His gift, a saltwater spring or a warhorse, depending on the version, was surpassed by Athena's olive tree. The Athenians, practical folk, chose the olives, and Athena got the city. Hades, meanwhile, retreated to his gloomy realm. Though depicted as a villain in later tales, he was perhaps the most dutiful of the three. His kingdom was orderly, bound by law, and surprisingly clean. He rarely ventured out, though when he did, it caused considerable trouble, as we shall see with one of Demeter's daughters. Demeter herself, the goddess of agriculture, tended to the fertility of the earth. Hestia kept the hearth-fires burning, and Hera, ever regal, became the queen of the gods. Though married to Zeus, her tolerance for his extramarital affairs was limited. Her jealousy, though infamous, was not unfounded. She was the goddess of marriage, after all. It must have stung when her own marriage was a soap opera. And so, Olympus thrived in its dramatic, dysfunctional way. But even as the gods built palaces and dispensed fates, the world did not stop changing. You see, Gaia was once again displeased. Her sons, the Titans, were still imprisoned. Tartarus groaned under their weight, and Gaia, who had birthed Uranus, who had nursed the Titans, who had helped overthrow 2 generations of rulers, now stirred with new indignation. She birthed a new child, not a Titan, not a god, but a monster. His name was Typhon. If the Titanomachy was a war of gods, then what followed was something far more primal. Typhon was a creature of chaos, born to undo what Zeus had built, towering, serpentine, with 100 dragon heads and the voice of many beasts. He was the very embodiment of fear and fury. But that is a story for the next breath, for the next clap of thunder. For now, we leave Olympus in its precarious peace, a mountain crowned with glory, but haunted by prophecies, betrayal, and the distant whisper of wings. And in this fragile lull, one lesson persists. Power in Greek mythology is never inherited for free. It must be seized, defended, and above all, outwitted. The gods are not static deities in the heavens, but beings of conflict and complexity. And though the Titans fell, their story is not quite over. For even in defeat, old forces whisper through the cracks of the world, waiting, like all fallen empires, for a chance to rise. It all begins, as so many great tales do, with an uneasy peace and a gathering storm. Cronus, king of the Titans, lord of time, and devourer of his own offspring, had done everything in his power to cling to his reign. But fate, the most stubborn of forces, had other plans. And Zeus, the child he had so diligently tried to avoid, was now a grown god, strong, clever, and in no mood to thank his father for the years his siblings spent in gastric darkness. The Titanomachy, a word that rolls off the tongue so nicely with a little practice, was the great war between the elder gods, the Titans, and the young upstarts, the Olympians. It would last 10 years, shake the very foundations of the cosmos, and mark the end of one divine era and the beginning of another. Let's set the scene. After Zeus tricked Cronus into disgorging his siblings, A brutal yet strangely satisfying family reunion. Cronus and Rhea's 6 children stood together: Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Hestia, Demeter, and Hera. A rather divine ensemble, though at this point they were more a ragtag band of revolutionaries than polished gods. Imagine not Westminster robes, but a divine version of the French Resistance. Cronus, of course, was not thrilled to see his children alive and well, and in no mood to forgive him. But he was not alone. He summoned his brothers and sisters, the Titans, rallying them around him. After all, they had ruled the cosmos since Uranus's defeat, and the thought of handing power over to these brash young gods was simply humiliating. On one side stood the Titans, led by Cronus and supported by mighty allies: Atlas, the general; Coeus, the inquisitor; Iapetus, the bringer of ends; and Oceanus, who wisely sat this one out with his rivers. Switzerland in the coming storm. Some of the Titanides also remained neutral or aloof, perhaps sensing which way the wind was blowing. On the other side were the Olympians, who, frankly, were the underdogs. Young, relatively inexperienced, and lacking the primordial might of the Titans. But Zeus had something Cronus could never grasp: strategy, allies, and the ability to turn chaos into an advantage. He also had brothers who didn't shy away from cunning, and sisters with wits to match. Now, as the myth goes, the war was not waged with swords and shields in the conventional sense. This was a veritable metaphysical melee. Mountains were hurled like stones. Lightning split the sky. Earthquakes, storms, rivers torn from their beds. Imagine a cosmic version of a rock concert, where every drumbeat causes tectonic plates to shift. Zeus, ever the ambitious son, knew he needed more than just brute force. So he did what many generals throughout history have done. He broke into prison and recruited the baddest asses he could find. Deep within Tartarus, his grandfather Uranus had imprisoned the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires, the monstrous children of Gaia and Uranus, exiled for being rather unsightly. Now, the Cyclopes, these one-eyed blacksmiths, were not merely brute force. They were artisans, masters of their craft. It was they who forged Zeus's lightning bolts, Poseidon's trident, and Hades's helm of invisibility. Rather generous, one must say, considering they had spent eons in divine solitary confinement. The Hecatonchires, meanwhile, were beings with 50 heads and 100 arms each, not ideal for fine motor skills, but excellent for hurling boulders at enemy fortresses. With them on the front lines, the tide of the war began to turn. It's worth noting that the Olympians' tactics here, recruiting the marginalized and arming them, are not so different from many human revolutions throughout history. The French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, even certain moments of Bolshevik ascendancy echo this mythical pattern. The excluded become the deciding factor. Myth reflects history, or perhaps history reflects myth. The war raged across the land of Thessaly, particularly in the region around Mount Othrys, the stronghold of the Titans, and Mount Olympus, the base of the young gods. You might imagine Olympus as a divine penthouse, but at this stage, it was more of a bunker than a palace. The battlefield wasn't confined to the earth. The sky itself echoed with thunder. The seas boiled with Poseidon's fury. The underworld trembled with Hades' commands. And through it all, Gaia, Mother Earth, groaned under the weight of divine wrath. At times, it seemed as if Gaia herself was rebelling. Her children on both sides tore her asunder. In later myths, she would give birth to Typhon in response to this agony. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Zeus proved to be a leader unlike Cronus. He delegated, a skill many monarchs fail to master. He led assaults, rallied his siblings, and coordinated his allies. Poseidon parted the seas to strike at Titan strongholds. Hades used his helm to infiltrate enemy ranks, sowing chaos and confusion. Hera and Demeter served as logisticians and strategists, keeping the Olympian effort organized and resilient. It was not just might, but intellect, and slowly, the Titans began to falter. The moment of decisive turning came when the Hecatoncheires hurled 1,000 boulders in a single volley, shattering the defenses of Mount Othrys. The destruction itself was mythologized as the sky being torn apart. Cronus, for all his cunning and might, knew the end was near. His forces were scattered. Some Titans fled. Others, like Iapetus and Creus, fought to the bitter end. But loyalty has its limits, especially when your enemy has thunderbolts and 100-handed giant on his side. Cronus was captured. Atlas, who had led the Titan army, was singled out for special punishment. The Titans, in general, were banished to Tartarus, a deep pit beneath the underworld, darker and more terrifying than any human hell. There they would remain, guarded by the Hecatoncheires. Poetic, one must say, considering the very beings they had once imprisoned were now standing guard over them. Zeus had achieved victory, but his victory came not solely through strength. It was adaptability, persuasion, and a profound understanding of the mythical impulse that made him king. Now, the Titanomachy is not just a mythical civil war. It is a template, a symbolic story of generational change. You'll find echoes of it in Norse mythology with the Vanir and Aesir, in Babylonian myths, where Marduk rises against Tiamat. Even in Shakespeare's plays, we hear the same tension, old orders versus new ideas. In Hesiod's Theogony, this war is not just the climax of a cosmic soap opera. It is a reflection on the inevitability of change. The Titans represent the raw, untamed power of nature, primordial, ancient, and unconcerned with mortal affairs. The Olympians, in contrast, embody a more structured cosmos. They have temples, they have priests, they have rules, sometimes bent, often broken, but rules nonetheless. Historically, some scholars suggest the Titanomachy may reflect real cultural shifts, perhaps the advent of new Indo-European religious systems supplanting older earth goddess traditions of the pre-Hellenic era. Others read it as pure allegory. Time devours its children, but wisdom, Zeus, prevails. Through whatever lens one views it, the story endures because it is so profoundly human. Fathers and sons, rebellion and rule, the fear of obsolescence and the audacity of youth. With victory and the imprisonment of the Titans, the cosmos found itself at a crossroads. For the first time, the universe was ruled not by abstract personifications of nature, but by gods with personalities, flaws, families, and, frankly, far more drama than was strictly necessary. Zeus and his brothers divided the world amongst themselves. Zeus took the sky, Poseidon the sea, and Hades, who always drew the short straw, was given the underworld. The earth was common ground, though Zeus, being Zeus, tended to consider common merely a suggestion, and so began the age of the Olympians. But peace, as we shall see, rarely lasts in myth, not when gods are involved. Still, for now, the thunder had ceased, the earth had stopped trembling, and somewhere in the vast darkness of Tartarus, Cronus pondered in silence, defeated by his own prophecy and his own son. History, myth, and family dinners all seem to carry the same lesson. Never underestimate your children. with the Titans cast into the shadowy depths of Tartarus, their mighty limbs bound by chains forged by the Cyclopes, and the Hecaton carers watching over them like the world's most enthusiastic prison guards. The Olympians could be forgiven for expecting a well-deserved rest. After all, a decade-long divine war can knock the spark out of anyone. But this, dear listener, is mythology. And if there's one lesson to be learned from it, it's that peace is merely a brief pause before the next catastrophe. Zeus now ruled from Mount Olympus, a rather lofty perch, to be sure, and he began laying the foundations for the cosmos as we understand it. Orderly, hierarchical, slightly theatrical. With his brothers, Poseidon and Hades, he divided the worlds. Zeus took the sky, Poseidon the sea, and Hades, with the weary acceptance of a younger brother denied first pick, took the underworld. The earth, that ever-suffering neutral territory, remained common ground, though one suspects Zeus took the lion's share when no one was looking. But ruling the world is one thing. Maintaining order among gods who possess not only egos the size of mountains, but the ability to level those mountains with a glance, that's quite another. The Olympians, you see, were a restless lot, full of rivalries, grievances, and profoundly dramatic love lives. If the Titans were the raw forces of nature, the Olympians were more like soap opera stars with divine powers, petty, powerful, and often strikingly egocentric. Still, for a time, Zeus managed to keep things under control. The cosmos settled into its new structure. Mortals began to populate the earth in greater numbers, though their place in the divine narrative was still somewhat secondary. Pawns, really, in the squabbles and flirtations of the gods, these early humans, hardly more than vertical shadows in Hesiod's vision, looked up at the gods with awe and terror, and occasionally served as collateral damage in divine disputes. But there was someone who was not pleased with the new order, someone ancient, rooted in the very bones of the world, someone with a rather personal grievance against both the Titans and the Olympians. Her name was Gaia, Earth itself, the mother of the Titans, the grandmother of the Olympians, and the one who had once spurred Cronus to rebel against Uranus, was now watching the same cycle play out again. And this time, she was not impressed. Cronus had become as tyrannical as Uranus. Zeus had overthrown him in almost the same manner, and now Zeus, with all his charm and thunderbolts, was treading the same path, becoming the very thing he fought to replace. One could almost hear her sigh in the rustling of leaves. So Gaia, eternally fertile in body and in vengeance, decided the new gods needed a reminder that even the mighty must bow to the truly ancient. And so she birthed again, but not a brood of gods, nymphs, or pleasant earth spirits, but a monster. Not just any monster, mind you. This was Typhon. If the Titans were the mountains of the world, then Typhon was a volcanic eruption, an earthquake, a hurricane. He was said to be taller than the highest peak, with 100 snakeheads that hissed and shrieked in every known language, and a few that are best left untranslated. His eyes spewed flame, his voice could shatter mountains, and from the waist down, he was a mass of writhing serpents. In other words, he was not someone you'd invite to dinner unless the meal included panic and the collapse of civilization. Now, Typhon was not alone. Beside him was Echidna, his mate, half woman, half snake, and together they spawned some of the most terrifying creatures in Greek mythology. Cerberus, the three-headed dog, the Chimera, with its trinity of lion, goat, and serpent, the multi-headed Linnaean Hydra, and the cunning Sphinx. This delightful family portrait of monstrosities would terrorize mortals and heroes for generations. One might say they were the mythological equivalent of relatives nobody wanted to see. But before all these nightmares emerged, Typhon himself made a direct beeline for Olympus, leaving a trail of scorched earth and terrified gods in his wake. The Olympians, for all their power, had never seen anything like it. Some fled, others held their ground briefly, before realizing that thunderbolts did little to a creature that could shake mountains off itself. According to some accounts, the gods actually turned into animals and fled to Egypt, which may have given rise to some of the animal-headed deities in Egyptian mythology. Nothing like a little intercultural borrowing under divine duress. Zeus, however, was not so easily cowed. Also, he would later claim, conveniently omitting the moment when he too, perhaps, briefly turned into a ram. In the climactic battle, Zeus ascended into the sky with thunder and storm at his back. Typhon met him with fire, wind, and 100 angry voices. The battle raged across the world. Mountains were ripped from their roots, rivers boiled, and the very sky cracked with the fury of their struggle. It was chaos unseen since the earliest days of creation, and for a moment it seemed as though the new order might fall before it had truly begun. But at first, things did not go well for the king of the gods. Typhon, in an act of mythical audacity, managed to seize Zeus and tear out his sinews. Yes, literally the cords that made Zeus function, and hid them in a cave. Without his strength, Zeus was helpless. It was only through the cunning of Hermes, who retrieved the sinews in a daring heist more suited to a Bond film than a Bronze Age hymn, that Zeus was restored. And then came the reckoning. With renewed strength and fury, Zeus unleashed the full power of the heavens upon Typhon. He struck him with lightning bolt after lightning bolt until the beast crashed to the ground. And where did he fall? Beneath Mount Etna in Sicily, a volcano that to this day occasionally spews smoke and flame. According to the Greeks, this is Typhon restlessly shifting in his prison. Each eruption a reminder that chaos can never be truly extinguished, merely buried. With victory over Typhon, Gaia's rebellion was quashed, and the Olympian order was restored. But it did not come without consequences. The gods learned a lesson, albeit a short-lived one. Power, however supreme, must be earned and defended, that the world itself, Gaia, cannot be taken for granted, and that the old forces, those born before law, language, and lightning, would always be there, in the shadows, waiting. It is tempting to see Typhon as merely a monster, a stock villain. But, like many figures in Greek mythology, he is more than he appears. He represents chaos, yes, but also resistance. He is the voice of the earth itself, roaring in response to its rulers. He is the fear that no matter how much you build, it can all come crashing down. That beneath civilization, savagery always waits. Historically, the tale of Typhon may reflect older myths of primordial monsters of chaos, such as Tiamat in Babylon or Leviathan in the Hebrew tradition. Many ancient cultures had stories in which a storm god battled a sea or serpent monster, symbolizing the battle between order and chaos, culture and nature. Zeus versus Typhon is the Greek version of this universal motif. It also likely reflects historical anxieties. Volcanoes, like Etna and Vesuvius, were unpredictable, terrifying forces, and giving them a face, a name, a story, was a way for ancient peoples to make sense of the incomprehensible. Myth, after all, was never just entertainment. It was the way humans made sense of the world in all its beauty and brutality. There's something beautiful and human in these stories. We all fear the collapse of the world we know. We all fear that the monsters we think we've buried might rise again. And we all hope that in the darkest moments, someone, perhaps in a winged cap and with a lyre in hand, will sneak in, restore what we've lost, and give us the strength to fight again. With victory over Typhon and the undisputed reign of the Olympians, the world entered what could be called a golden age. Though, as we shall see, gold tarnishes rather quickly in the hands of immortals. For now, however, Zeus ruled supreme. His brothers maintained their kingdoms. The earth was relatively quiet. The gods, ever capricious, turned their attention to mortal affairs. And deep beneath the surface, in caves, craters, and tangled roots, the remnants of the old world waited, silent, but never entirely gone. Because in myth, as in life, nothing stays buried forever. With Typhon's entombment beneath Mount Etna and the triumphant ascent of the Olympians to their celestial thrones, one might think the cosmos had finally found its rhythm, a sort of divine jazz ensemble, if you will, with Zeus conducting from the heavens, Poseidon rumbling beneath the waves, and Hades crooning ominously in the underworld. Peace, however, is not the natural state of gods. It is merely a lull between scandals. In this post-Typhon era, the world entered what Greek poets loved to call the Golden Age, a time when mortals lived without toil, pain, or taxes, which is probably what makes it mythical. Food grew without planting. The weather was perpetually pleasant, and the gods, for the most part, minded their own divine business. But, as one might expect, the seeds of future catastrophe were already sprouting. And this time, those seeds bore the name Prometheus. Ah yes, Prometheus, the cunning Titan who brought fire, the eternal meddler in divine affairs, while his brethren were tossed into Tartarus or otherwise vanquished. Prometheus played his hand with remarkable foresight during the Titanomachy. He sided with Zeus. Well, technically, he sided with whoever he thought would win, and that turned out to be Zeus, and for a time that earned him a seat at the provisional Olympian table. Prometheus, whose name, quite fittingly, means forethought, was no typical Titan. Where others were brute force or natural phenomena, Prometheus was intellect, fire, invention, craft, cunning. If the Olympians were the showmen, Prometheus was the backstage crew, making sure the spotlights didn't fall from the ceiling. Now, according to Hesiod and other ancient sources, Prometheus grew attached to mortals, perhaps too attached. In some tales, he even created them, sculpting humans out of clay, with Athena breathing life into them. Whether sculptor or savior, Prometheus saw humanity as a project worth investing in, a bold choice considering what we've turned into. But Zeus had a different vision. For him, humans were pawns, amusing at best, expendable at worst. He was determined to keep them dependent, obedient, and, above all, ignorant of divine secrets. Chief among these was fire, that crackling golden essence of civilization. Fire meant cooking, forging, building. In other words, progress. And progress, Zeus feared, might one day lead to defiance. So naturally, Prometheus stole it. Not subtly, mind you. He crept onto Olympus, ignited a stalk of fennel from the sacred flame, and brought it down to humanity like a rebellious torchbearer at the most subversive Olympic ceremony in history. With that single act, humanity leaped from ignorance to innovation. Fires were lit in the night. Metal took shape under hammers, and roasted meat replaced the eternal chewing of raw roots. Civilization, in short, began to flicker to life. And Zeus was furious. He could forgive much. Rebellion, hubris, even accidental carelessness with a mortal. But not defiance, not when it made him look foolish. So he devised a punishment, both eternal and agonizing. Prometheus was chained to a rock, some say in the Caucasus, others on a desolate peak, where even the mountain goats feared to tread. And every day, an eagle, sacred to Zeus, would descend and peck out his liver. And every night, the liver would grow back anew, and the torment would begin again. Now, to the ancient Greeks, the liver was the seat of emotions and vitality, not the heart, as we might think today. So it wasn't just physical torment. It was a daily unraveling of his very essence. A bit excessive, perhaps. But then again, moderation was never Zeus's strong suit. Prometheus, however, wasn't the only one to suffer for his philanthropy. Humanity, newly warmed and empowered, also became the target of divine retribution. Zeus, with all the theatrical flair of an offended deity, commissioned a punishment with his usual knack for poetic irony. He created a woman. Enter Pandora. Now, before we all get modernly indignant, it's worth noting that the Greeks, particularly Hesiod, had a very mixed opinion of Pandora. She was beautiful, charming, and crafted by the hands of all the gods, hence her name, all gifted. Aphrodite gave her allure, Apollo music, Hermes curiosity, and patience. Well, not so much. She arrived with a jar, not a box, contrary to what centuries of mistranslation have led us to believe. A large, sealed jar, filled with evils yet unseen by humankind. Pain, hunger, jealousy, disease, taxes again, and all the subtle misfortunes of human life. And of course, curiosity, that irrepressible itch to know what must remain unknown. Predictably, Pandora opened it. Sufferings of all kinds flew out, scattering across the earth like spilled ink across a clean scroll. By the time she slammed the lid shut, only one thing remained inside. Hope, a strange thing, to be sure, to lock hope amongst evils. Was it a consolation left behind, or the cruelest illusion of all? The Greeks weren't entirely sure, and perhaps that ambiguity was the point. And so, humanity, now armed with fire, but cursed with mortality and misfortune, began its long, winding journey through history. Prometheus, watching from his rocky perch, must have wondered if it was all worth it. The gods, meanwhile, resumed their celestial shenanigans. Yet, the story of Prometheus did not end in chains. In time, a new hero would arise, Heracles, and it was he, passing through the mountains during one of his 12 labors, who would notice the bound Titan and, moved by something akin to pity, slay the eagle and break his bonds. Zeus, by then either softer or more distracted, allowed it. Perhaps he even admired the sheer audacity of a mortal challenging him, though he would never say so aloud. The tale of Prometheus is often read as a mythological blueprint for the human condition. Intellect versus power, progress versus punishment, and the eternal price of defiance. The fire he stole represents not just literal flame, but metaphorical enlightenment, science, art, reason, imagination. He is the first rebel, the first scientist, the first martyr for the cause of humanity. And perhaps the Greeks saw something of themselves in Prometheus. A people whose philosophers questioned the heavens, whose engineers bent nature to their will, and whose playwrights dared to explore the flaws of the gods. In Prometheus, they found a figure both heroic and tragic, a reminder that progress always comes with a price, and that defiance, however noble, is rarely left unpunished. Historically, some scholars have argued that Prometheus may be even older than the Olympians themselves. Elements of his tale echo Mesopotamian and Indo-European myths. The fire thief, the culture bringer, a god who aids mortals against the will of his brethren. His punishment strikingly resembles that of other chained rebels, such as the Norse Loki or even the biblical Satan, whose overreach meets with cosmic imprisonment. But unlike those darker figures, Prometheus is rarely seen as evil. He is a complex hero, proud, intelligent, stubborn, and self-sacrificing. He defies the gods not for his own gain, but to uplift others, and in this, he becomes a symbol of something profoundly human: the refusal to accept imposed limitations, the belief that knowledge should be shared, not hidden, that even Zeus's thunderbolts can be challenged, if only for a moment. It is hardly surprising that later thinkers, from romantic poets to modern philosophers, have embraced Prometheus as a symbol of rebellion and creativity. Percy Bysshe Shelley portrayed him as a noble sufferer, while Karl Marx saw him as the archetype of the revolutionary. Even Mary Shelley, crafting her tale of scientific hubris, titled it Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, hinting at the eternal tension between creator, creation, and consequence. And so, in this interlude between divine wars and heroic sagas, we witness a quieter, yet no less potent drama: the birth of civilization, not by divine grace, but through theft, not with permission, but through rebellion, and an understanding that for every step forward, there's a whip crack from behind. As the Olympians lounged on their thrones, watching mortals kindle fires, build temples, and forge philosophies, perhaps they sensed that their time, however long, would not be eternal. For the gift of fire is the seed of questioning, and once you ask why, even a god must eventually answer. The story of the Titans is not merely a tale of giants, storms, and clashing divine armies. It is also the story of those who come after, the thinkers, the rebels, the fire-bearers. And in Prometheus, we find the bridge between the age of monsters and the age of men. A titan, yes, but perhaps the most human of them all.